Well, Jessica, we are absolutely honored that you're here with us today. And I'm going to give her a quick introduction before she jumps into her session. But Jessica Malnik is a conversion content marketer and copywriter who's a strategist at heart and loves to execute and write at a high level. Her writing has been featured in The Next Web, Winter, Social Media Examiner, SEMrush, HubSpot, South by Southwest, MSN, UK, and more. So she knows her stuff. She's got stuff out there that you should go read. Jessica also works alongside her team to build out the Remote Work Tribe, which is her twice a month newsletter and podcast dedicated to helping founders, CEOs, and marketers lead remote first teams. And just in a moment, I'm going to drop her socials in the chat for you to follow. And just a reminder, today's session will be recorded. If you have to drop early, we'll send it to you. And then again, drop any of your Q&As for Jessica via the Zoom Q&A feature. Okay, I'm going to hand over the mic to you. Thank you so much for being with us today. And if I forgot anything about your professional bio that you would like to share with us, please do. So thank you so much for being here.
Awesome. I really appreciate you having me on this webinar. First and foremost, can everybody see my screen? I'm assuming that is a yes. But yeah, so today I'm going to kind of talk about how to construct a content moat to drive growth, and also why you should be doing that in the first place. So in these slides, I'm going to cover things like the top 3 components that I consider for building a content moat, the crucial mindset shifts you need to make before you can start, an underrated approach to baking distribution into both the ideation, research, and writing process, so it's not just an afterthought, and some very quick practical tips and lessons I have learned along the way. So the reason why all this started and how I kind of came up with this framework to begin with was what I'd consider kind of the before times, where there's a lot of ad hoc throwing spaghetti at the wall, figuring out, getting ideas for a post from all over the place, from, my clients, their team, all of the things in there. And it all felt very ad hoc and not very strategic. And that often meant that your results, you didn't really know what was really working and what wasn't working. So oftentimes, because of that, you wound up in a situation where it kind of felt like what I consider the content hamster wheel. I'm sure many of us can relate to this, where you're just producing more and more content. And it feels like the more you produce, the more you're expected to produce, and you're not really sure what is actually working and driving the needle versus what isn't. So this is kind of my framework as an antidote to this, so you can stop having to produce more and more content, instead focus on the really strategic assets that are going to drive meaningful growth over time. So in order to do that, first and foremost, we need to first recognize that in 2024, and quite frankly, even in 2021 and even in 2020 and 2019, keyword research is no longer enough. It's no longer enough to just have use the same exact tools, whether that's Ahrefs, SEMrush, you name it, out there, and just literally have a list of keywords and just start creating the same exact content as everyone else in your niche. That just doesn't, it worked in 2013. It worked a little bit in 2015. It still kind of sort of works today, but this is not a really smart way to create any sort of differentiated content that is actually going to grow over time. So a better thing is, and another way to say that is keyword research is rinsed and repeated. A better thing, and where I try to get everyone to think in this way, particularly with my clients, is instead of starting with keyword research, start with audience and or customer research, which is proprietary and powerful and way more unique and way more likely to lead to differentiated copy and differentiated content than starting with keyword research, where you're basically starting on the same tools and the same thing as everyone else. And if you're like a lot of my clients who are startups and or small businesses, you can't necessarily compete with a 100-person marketing department if you're using the exact same tools. So you need to really lean into what makes you different. And oftentimes the best way to do that, in my experience, is through audience research. So after I kind of changed my strategy, this is kind of an anonymous example of one of my clients when it came to their traffic and also their conversions. So, in order to do any of this to start out, you need to build a strong foundation first and foremost. Sounds obvious, but it's really, really easy to forget this point, particularly if you've been working for a while in your current role. So, first and foremost, you need to get really clear on who your ideal customer profile or ideal client profile actually is. There's an amazing book that I think is a super practical version of the jobs to be done. That's kind of a mashup of the jobs to be done framework and also just a more practical version called Deploy Empathy by Michelle Hansen. One of my favorite books that I like to give, particularly to people who are brand new to jobs to be done, but don't necessarily want to go through the entire framework. This is just a very actionable 80-20 version of this that is so incredibly helpful to help you get really clear on who your ICP is. And I always like to recommend it's all about focusing in on intent and buying signals, not just demographics. And even if you get pushback from your boss or founders or execs, try to do at the very least a minimum of 3 customer interviews just so you can get a baseline. There are definitely tricks and tips that I've learned where if that's not always possible, you can still get some of this by listening to sales calls, support calls, mining voice of customer research on, Capterra, G2, Reddit, and elsewhere. However, I'm still like, it does not replace doing these customer interviews. And this book is a great example of how to weed these. And then you can start to analyze these customer interviews and actually using AI to help you in an 80-20 way. So you can start to create like customer personas and that are again focused on intent and buying signals, which really are kind of the backbone for all of the content you're going to create to build out this content mode that's going to compound over time. So you can get off of that content hamster wheel and instead create flagship evergreen pieces that are fewer, but way more impactful over time. So the other piece of this is as part of this. So the second step is to identify your key themes. What are kind of the key messaging points that you want your brand to be known for? So what do you, and also who, if you have, key stakeholders in the business who are going to be doing some thought leadership, what is kind of their personal brand to be known for? And where's kind of that crossover between what you want the business to be known for and also what these key personal brands that you have as well? Where's that intersection point? The more you can get clear on who these key themes are, the better it's going to be able to build out this moat that's going to actually resonate. And this will give your content structure and a narrative. So you aren't all over the place. And more importantly, like your ideal customers and ideal prospects are going to know what you're about and how you can help them. And the key here is about focusing and niching it down. Focus and niching down, especially at the beginning of this, makes it way easier for people to stand out and for people to remember you and the problems that your company solves. And that just makes it way more likely that people are going to stay top of mind. So if you're attracting the 95% of people who are not currently looking for a solution like yours right now, when they are starting to look for it, they're going to be way more likely to remember your brand and include you in those, 2 or 3 or 4 solutions that they're looking at to solve that problem. So here's an example for just myself in my own business of some key themes that I use in my business. So these are things that I've kind of honed over several years, which is you don't need more writers, you need more marketers who can write. AI doesn't replace human creativity, it amplifies it. And most brands say they want to produce more thought leadership, but few are willing to put in the work to do this. That's why thought leadership content is still very valuable. And again, you can kind of see this as an example, but like every single company should have, somewhere between 3 and 5 key themes that are kind of the backbone undercurrent that are going to give your content strategy, structure, and narrative. So you don't necessarily have to talk about every single key theme across each piece of content you do, but every single post should at least go back to at least 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 or more of these key themes in your content. So then you now have the backbone, which is, who your ICP is. You're really clear on that and you're really clear on your key themes. Now it's time to actually build your content moat. And my framework is actually 3 key points. There are 3 components to it. Insights, which you can kind of think about in terms of the content and the messaging. Community, which is how I'm kind of describing distribution here, because it's a little bit bigger than how a lot of people think about distribution. And content efficiency, which is how you can do more with less. So let's start with insights, which I think is the most important. That's your messaging. And there's kind of some key components that each piece of that your strategy as a whole should have. And then each individual asset should all include these components as well, which is content positioning, which in my opinion is the most underrated aspect of content marketing today. And it's not just for your brand, but also for every individual asset should have this. And you can think of it as context setting for each piece of content. You can also think about having a point of view so basically you're not just creating copycat content that everyone else has, you're creating something that's a little bit more memorable and more differentiated. Depth, are you being thorough and exploring all the angles that might be relevant to this topic? Another one, and I kind of go back to actually from my journalism school days, which is why should anyone care about this piece of content? Sounds a little bit harsh, but if you have a compelling answer there, it's going to make your content stand out a lot more. And finally, if there's SEO as a key component to this, you also can't ignore search intent, which is what you're talking about matching the intent behind the keyword you're targeting? Yeah. So the next key component is community, which is it's all about building these real relationships. So community to me is kind of like 10x version of distribution. And that's about really kind of going back into how do we build real relationships with especially people in our niche, but especially the super connectors in our niche. And you can kind of do that by baking it through your entire content creation process. So what a lot of companies do, and what I've been guilty of at times before, is I treat distribution as an afterthought. Maybe you have a checklist. So you publish your post and you have a checklist of we need to post this on social media. We need to post this on LinkedIn. We need to post this on Instagram. We need to post this on Facebook, XYZ. We need to optimize this, put this in our newsletter, send out an email. Maybe we share it with sales. Maybe we share it in the company Slack channel. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a really good starting place. However, if you want to kind of get more from each individual asset, thinking about it from a community lens instead can go a lot farther. So it's how do we bake in people from especially the super connectors or the influencers in our niche into our process. So that could look like, co-creating with them, asking for them to do interviews for part of our content, using quotes from them, co-creating a piece together. That's how you can that's how you can kind of build out this really, really impactful distribution engine that's going to grow exponentially as opposed to just taking the checkbox approach to content distribution. And the best part of this is like, while having your own branded community is a great way to kind of go about doing this, it's not necessarily realistic for a lot of brands, particularly smaller brands and startups. And it's also really expensive, and it tends to take about a year or two before you start to see really positive ROI from it. So you don't necessarily have to have your own branded community to do any of this. It's just more about figuring out how you can build these real relationships with people in your industry, particularly those super connectors, and get them bought in and baked into your process. So the third piece of this, so you have the first piece, which is insights, the second piece, which is community, and the third piece of my content moat framework is content efficiency. And this is, in my opinion, the easiest step, but what most companies don't do consistently or at all. And that's taking all of the hard work that you've done from creating these existing assets and the community you've built and making it work harder for you. Because what's so easy to do is you get shiny object syndrome. You create that piece of content, it's great, and then you're on to the next one, and all of your old content creates dust. Happens all the time. These are some ways that you can actually make those existing assets work harder for you so that they're growing your moat as opposed to just collecting digital dust. And there's a few different ways to go about it. The first one is also going to be a nod to ClearScope here, which is updating your evergreen content assets. So here's kind of a framework I use, and you don't necessarily need to be updating it all the time. However, I do recommend at least once a year, sometimes, 2 or 3 times a year if you have a really large content backlog, going back in and updating your evergreen assets. And here's what I kind of look for here is, do you have content ranking, particularly on the SEO side of things, that are kind of stuck on the bottom of page 1, anywhere on page 2, or have lost at least 35% of its search traffic? Have you recently done any sort of website revamp, rebrand, and or have a bunch of content that are still talking about old value props? Those are kind of the key two things that I look for when it comes to figuring out what should be updated and how to prioritize it, is in those two stages. And then for individual pieces, yes, tools like ClearScript are some of my favorite ways to kind of go back through and optimize it. But I'm really looking for what are the gaps that we're missing? What info or examples are outdated? What original insights or experiences that we have that we can include on this topic from kind of the content positioning point of view side of things? And then you also have the SEO side of it, which is where I'm using tools like ClearScope to go in and making sure that those evergreen assets are actually still optimized for the right keywords that we should be targeting. So that's kind of one of the quickest wins when it comes into updating evergreen content. Another win that I think is being played out a little bit more today, but I still think there's a lot of opportunity, is creating a company newsletter. You want to make sure you have some sort of compelling point of view or angle for why you're doing it. However, it's just a really great way to go to actually be able to be a little bit more memorable and get more mileage out of every piece of content you're creating. And some additional points to think about as you're creating that newsletter is start by just being like really, really an active listener wherever your target prospects and customers are hanging out online. Get to know who the influencers and connectors are in the space. If you're already doing that as part of step 2 in my framework, which is community, you're already going to be a step ahead. And then amplify the connectors, the influencers, and rising stars within your newsletter. So you're kind of co-creating with them and also giving them a nod as well. Don't forget about amplifying your existing customers. So a newsletter is a way to be able to kind of get more mileage out of your existing content, but also do some goodwill when it comes to amplifying your existing customers, which oftentimes will make your product look better. And also amplify the connectors, influencers, and rising stars in your space so they want to co-create more content with you. A third piece is what I'm going to call social and guest post, which is especially any sort of leveraging any sort of pillar pages and guides that you have and repurposing and spinning off either entire sections or angles of that into social media posts for within your company, or especially within key thought leaders within your company to use, as well as guest posts on third-party sites. This is going to build your authority. It's going to give you more reach and or resonate more. If you're doing it well, you can also build backlinks if it's doing it through guest posting. And the added benefit is you're not writing 100% original content. Even the social post, you can oftentimes reuse 70 to 80% of it and then just figure out a better hook, maybe add an additional example, some additional takeaways so it's written to that platform. But it's just a really easy way to get a lot more mileage out of each of these evergreen assets and more exposure on other platforms. So some additional ways to kind of bake, that's kind of my framework again, going back to it, which is insights, community, and content efficiency. So here's some additional ways to bake distribution or community into your ideation process as you're doing your strategy. So first and foremost, it's I always want to just be careful about getting ideas from your competitors. And the reason why is you don't necessarily know why your competitors are creating the content they're creating. You can maybe guess it, but more often than you might think, they might not even have a strategy at all. So you could end up just be creating a whole bunch of content that has no strategy, and it's the blind leading the blind. So even though it's really easy to kind of see what your competitors are doing, just be taking any of the ideas that they have with a grain of salt and make sure you're doing your own research first. Again, probably noticing a theme here. Figure out where your ICP hangs out online and or what you're talking about and figuring out ways to, create your own spin on some of that content. That's how you're going to find way more ideas that are often going to resonate. Find ways to invite influencers or creators into your content creation process. Look for patterns when it comes to customer interviews, sales call recordings, support calls. If you see patterns, you see trends, you see certain pain points or goals or examples that are showing up, 3 or more times, chances are that's a good sign that there's probably some content you can create around that that's going to resonate. Analyze social media, customer reviews on Capterra, G2, Reddit. Reddit is probably my favorite place and one of the most underrated places to get content ideas. Chances are, regardless on whether you are an accounting firm or you have SaaS software for pool managers, whatever random niche you have, there's probably at least one subreddit out there about that topic, and just go filter in by what are the things that are getting the most upvotes and also the most comments within that subreddit, and figuring out, are there angles that you can explore and create content there? And chances are, if you create that content, it's probably going to do well because it's already done well on Reddit, which is usually a good signal that people care about that topic. And then, of course, organize all of your ideas into content hubs as you're building out your strategy. I won't kind of get into that directly in this presentation, but I'm happy to chat more about that with anyone offline. So here are some just very quick tips when it comes to practical tips that I've learned the hard way as I built out this framework. First and foremost, practice saying, remember those key themes I brought up at the beginning? Practice saying them 20 different ways. Really, this is the heart of good marketing. But it's also just a key piece of just resonating deeply and staying top of mind with your ICP so that, you can attract more of those people in that 95% into that 5% when they are ready to, buy that solution. You also want to use storytelling to reinforce the key points and takeaways from within your key themes. And just a key point here, if it feels like you're repeating yourself and just sick of talking about this key theme, keep going, as that's usually just about the time when your ICP is just starting to get it. So kind of double down on that. And if you are like me and sometimes struggle with making sure that you are repeating yourself in different ways, building out a swipe file through can help you with that, with all kind of your key themes and also those key content pieces that you have. I use Airtable for this personally, but there are so many different tools that you can use to practice saying the same thing 20 different ways. Another one that I think is super, super common is making sure that you're obsessing about the key takeaways and not just the story. Storytelling is amazing. However, storytelling without key takeaways can sometimes just feel like journaling. And that's not necessarily going to be as impactful as using a story to kind of get a key point away. And here's a framework that I learned a few years ago that's really helped me and might help out a few more people, which is, as you're kind of storytelling, think about it as like, start with your big idea that you want to communicate, illustrate it with your story, share the solution, and then reiterate that big idea that you have for extra emphasis. And that's a way to make it so that your story is going to resonate more. And also just tie it back to the key points of that big idea or that big takeaway that you want somebody to have when they're reading or listening to this. Another key point is add your personality and write like a human. AI is great for efficiency. I use it all the time. However, the content you're producing shouldn't sound like a robot created it, especially if you want it to be effective. Adding your personality and having kind of a distinct voice is kind of the key to resonating deeper and being more memorable. And kind of a key thing that I like to think about here is, if my content were put on my competitor's website, would people still know it was my brand? And if you're honest about yourself, if the answer is yes, you're doing everything right. However, a lot of people probably can't say that. And that's just a really good benchmark that I tend to use when it comes to thinking about how can you make sure that your content is going to resonate deeper with your audience. And then also making sure that you're just very practical point with this, which is making sure that you're writing in a way that is just approachable and relatable too. It's really easy, particularly if you aren't a subject matter expert on the topic that you're marketing, to try to sound smart or rely on jargon or marketing and sales speak. And oftentimes that can just be like, I don't necessarily know how to say this, but like counterintuitive to your goals. And where instead, if you're just more confident in using simple language and being more relatable, it's going to resonate a lot more than if you feel like you have to use $10 words and a lot of marketing speak and sales jargon. Also, adding personality does not mean you need to be like Wendy's or Duolingo. You can add personality without being unhinged. Also, another key point here is don't confuse reach for resonance. You want to persuade, educate, and inspire your ICP so they take your desired actions, like scheduling that demo or signing up for your newsletter. However, reach alone won't do that. You need to resonate, and you can only do that through writing for impact and connection. Also, another thing is if you're just going off of info posts, they're commodities. And in the age of AI that we're in now, that's just a race to the bottom and a way to kind of stay stuck on that content hamster wheel forever and ever and ever. So think about wanting to write for resonance before reach. So that is all of the things within this presentation. I think I am almost exactly at the 20 to 25 minutes that Amanda told me. So where are the questions that people have?
Hi. This has been great. Thank you so much. I laughed out loud when you said, I really actually did over here by myself with my cats in my house. You can add personality without becoming unhinged. I was like, yes, yeah. And then if you do become unhinged, I mean, that resonates with some folks, right? Right. So yeah, I have a lot of questions myself. I'm going to ask a couple before I jump into the Q&A that we received, if that's cool. Um, but we,
Absolutely.
but we do have some submitted by the audience as well. Okay, so you mentioned that you create a copy swipe file using Airtable. So do you have like, and maybe this is just being curious for myself, but do you have like templates that you share with people or like examples of how you use that in building your swipe file? And also kind of connecting that back to, you said like have those several key points and get really good at saying them like 20 different ways. Do you store that all in your swipe file as well?
Yes, I definitely store all of that in my swipe file. And that is a great question. And also giving me an idea because I do not currently have that template. But you are probably persuading me to create that. And I will definitely send that over to anyone who wants it, who's listening to this live or the recording later on.
Well, I love a good template. I love to see how like other people organize their work as well. And yeah, I just hadn't thought about using Airtable for a swipe file before. And I feel like that's pretty smart. Okay, so another question that I have, this has actually come up a lot this last year in our webinars. This idea of like we need to be collecting what our like actual humans want to know and not just like what search tools tell us volume, monthly
Mhm.
volume is, which you also highlighted as well. So I wanted to ask you, what's your process for collecting that information, like from sales and customers teams? Have you found one that's worked really well, or does it depend on your client and how they kind of organize things? And the second part of that question is, how are you successfully influencing your clients and the teams that you work with to do that kind of work? Especially if you're like contracted in, it's sometimes hard for you to get that information.
Yeah. So answering how I kind of get those voice of customer research. Got it. I love that question. So the first part of this is probably going to sound sacrilegious to some of the SEOs who might be listening to this, is I really don't pay that much attention to keyword volume in particular, personally, for two reasons. One, I have seen firsthand the volume estimates, particularly on tools like Ahrefs and SEM on SEMrush, being not as accurate as they claim to be. I've lost count of the number of times where I've seen one that had a 0 under it and only to realize that I was getting like hundreds of pieces of traffic. However, the beauty of also having focusing much more on audience research and customer research first and foremost is if you're writing that bottom of funnel evergreen content assets, you don't need to be going after hundreds of thousands or millions of traffic to see really impactful results. Honestly, most of my clients have somewhere between 5,000 and 100,000 visits, users on their blogs and on their content a month. And that's usually enough to really fuel, particularly if you're like, a 7-figure or a low 8-figure business. Like that is more than enough especially if it's targeted well, to be able to get you the number of leads that you're actually going to need from your content. So the first part is I don't really look at volume that much. The second part is, and maybe I'm spoiled because I am coming in as the contractor slash micro agency. I do all my own strategy. I do have a small team, but I do all the strategy. I'm the only account manager too. So I won't work with somebody if I know that I cannot at least get access to a handful of support calls, and or if they can't necessarily don't necessarily already have customer interviews in place, I at the very least need to be interviewing at least 2 or 3 people in their sales team and or have access to sales and support calls um, before I even create any sort of content strategy in place. If they don't have that, I'm usually like, hey, I'm happy to help you with this. I'm happy to create the interviews for you. But I don't personally run into that issue. I know a lot of other people do. And my recommendation there that I'm always telling people is baby steps. You don't necessarily need to start out by having a ton of customer research. If you can't get that buy-in early on, I actually have a presentation on this that I did a while back where it's like start off by just analyzing what people are saying about your company and your competitors on Reddit. Spend 2 hours doing that, and or spend just an hour a week, even if it's on your free time. I know that sucks to say that. Listening to one sales call, you will learn so much, and if you bank that in that process over the course of 3 months or 6 months, you'll start to understand that pulse of what customers actually care about.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer. I had to hold my tongue to not be like, yes, yes, Jessica. So I actually started myself, like, I do like SEO, but I started in the content world. And it really resonates with me. What you said is like, you've built entire successful content strategies not around seeking search volume. And that's something that I regularly saw in my work is like how do we answer questions from sales teams and customers and real leads and like solve those pain points at that like bottom of the funnel and then like work our way back over time if we want to like capture more of those like high traffic searches. But I think that's really wise and good advice. Okay, someone asked what is robotic writings? Can you clarify? Does that just mean like AI generated stuff for?
Yeah, it just means like, are you using words that are clearly just have like you're not talking like how your customers actually talk, and or potentially using words that are usually tells that it's just low quality, one shot lazy prompts like elevate, unlock, unleash, delve. There's a lot of the words.
I know. I was thinking about those words the other day and I was like, I know we're all frustrated that like AI content generators give us those, but did it learn that from us?
Yes.
You know?
And it's continuing to learn from us. So eventually it's going to keep just reinforcing those bad habits.
Yes, exactly. And then I loved what you said about like you won't work with them if they don't give you access to some of that information. I think that's really powerful to hold that boundary because if you're creating successful strategies out of that, those customer calls and customer surveys and stuff like that. Yeah, I think that's a really smart boundary to have. Okay.
I mean, I just feel like how can you create a strategy if you don't actually know what your customers care about?
Right. They're like, give me the search volume. And it's like, it doesn't work in that way. It really doesn't. Okay. So let me see if there were any other questions that I had before jumping in. Oh, I wanted to share that I loved the phrase collecting digital dust because that's exactly what it feels like when we just like leave content that we worked hard on out there to just rot away, like the content decay thing, which ClearScope talks about a lot. And then also I wanted to mention, oh yeah, like when you're like digging into like your customer teams and sales calls, like that's a really great way to get information gain, which we talk a lot about at ClearScope as well, to like incorporate in your actual content. So we do have some questions here. I think those were my notes. And if I'm like shifting between like where I'm looking, I'm just looking at my other screen here so I don't get too lost. But okay, Dave asks, how much are you currently splitting your content targeting with like the superconductors and the influencers versus like traditional, maybe like content strategy message? And like, how are you doing that? And do you feel like this is like a small shift in your thinking or a larger shift?
That is a really good question. I'm gonna give the classic marketing answer of it depends. In general, it's going to depend on kind of the life cycle of your content. If you are pretty new to having a content strategy and are new to content marketing, I'm going to say in general, you're probably going to want to start by just making sure you're tackling all of those just bare bone foundational bottom of funnel assets. So in that case, weaving in influencers as you can. However, that's less important than just having those foundational assets. As you have a more established program, I think at that point, that's where you really can lean in to bringing in more of those influencers in any way you possibly can into your content creation process.
Yeah. When you say foundational assets, are you talking about content assets specifically? Like maybe a couple examples of those?
Yes. I would say both content. I do both content and copy, which is a little bit unique. But I would say in terms of those foundational bottom of funnel assets, I'm talking about making sure you have at least a couple of case studies or customer success stories, having those, very key, buyer's guide type of pieces of content that like very key, like, here's why our product is better. Maybe that includes a comparison page, maybe it doesn't. Those kind of niche landing pages around all your solutions pages, which is a little bit more copy focused. And then all those kind of key fundamental pillar pages that are tied to core themes within your content should be done first.
Well, thank you for answering that. Okay, next question. I work at a larger org that has several teams working in silos. How do you recommend getting leadership to buy into more collaboration across teams to make sure messaging is consistent across like your marketing materials and sales teams?
That is an amazing question, and I wish I had an amazing answer. I, for better or worse, definitely specialize working in with smaller marketing teams. So I will kind of say the advice I give there could work here with a little bit of nuance, which is kind of lead by example. So kind of take whatever authority you and respect you have within the team, share by example. Don't tell people how it should be. Instead, just kind of talk by like showcasing, hey, here's some examples. What do you think about this? And making feel people have bought into that process and kind of meeting them where they are. And then slowly over time, and I suspect it might take, as frustrating as it is, months, maybe even quarters to do this, you'll start to kind of get the trust of those other teams so you can kind of eliminate the silos, but it's hard.
Yeah, it's definitely hard when you're like an outsider contracted in.
Yes.
But it's still important because a lot of times I think people forget, and this is like the pain with like content marketing, but how much we do to connect like all the different parts of like the messaging in the company. Yeah, it's very essential. Okay, so next question, what's your process for finding high value backlinks around like niche market or topics? And what's your vetting process for guest post opportunities? Because you were talking about that guest posting as well.
Yeah. The first thing I look for is there a way that we can collaborate with an influencer or a super connector within our niche already to do some sort of guest post or some sort of collaboration, some sort of podcast, video, webinar with other people who are already super connectors? That is like number one, numero uno. Are there other kind of co-marketing opportunities that make a ton of sense? That's kind of what I prioritize as tier one. Tier two, if you need to do a whole bunch of additional backlinks besides that, then just go use Ahrefs, SEMrush, figure out what that is, prioritize it. And I usually just try to make sure that the domain rating or the domain authority is over 30. But outside of that, that's kind of like my lower priority. But I usually very much defer towards what are the co-marketing opportunities or what are ways that we can collaborate with, kind of the super connectors in the industry. Because then you're getting a lot more than just a backlink.
Yes. Yeah. At that point, it almost feels, and maybe like the people with PR backgrounds will be like, Amanda, you don't know what you're talking about. But it almost feels like public relations, like community
Yes.
building. And yeah.
There's a
um,
reason I've kind of joked that backlinks, when it's done well, is just digital PR.
I mean, that's true. Like when it's done from like a quality perspective, like I have a confession. In my years of being in content marketing, I've never purchased a backlink. Like
Me
I
neither.
yes. That did it like 10 years ago, right? Like back in the day. And I understand that is an important tactic for some people. But after you start working on that like good content, you just you start connecting with people. I love that. Like it's in a lot of ways it's that like healthy PR perspective.
Yeah. I've
Um,
also never bought a backlink and also never sold one, even though I get a lot of people on a couple of blogs that I've written for a lot asking me to include a link for a fee. And I'm like, yeah, I'm doing this.
yes, I love that. Yeah. I mean, I also love if that's part of people's strategy. Like, do what works for you and your client. But yeah, I also have never like received payment for backlinks. Um, okay, so let's see. How do you find where your ICPs are hanging out online? What are your best tips there? Like, do you have like a pretty manual process when you start working with a client, or are there any tools that you use?
Love this question. Amazing question. Don't overthink it. Two ways that I do this. One, I use a tool called SparkToro. It's Rand Fishkin's product, newer product. It's great for audience research. And two, ask people on these customer interviews. Anytime you do a case study interview, I do a lot of those. I always make a point of figuring out, asking them how they heard about you, where they hang out online. People will tell you this. Just get in customer interviews. Ask your sales team, your support team. You're going to get a lot of answers there. And also SparkToro is just an amazing just supplement to that. I am hoping it's okay. I can plug another software that's not Skillshare.
Yes, please do. So actually, Rand did a session with us back in July, I think. He talks a lot about risotto recipes as examples on his session. So if you love a good cooking tips while you're learning about marketing, it's the place to go. But yeah, I've used SparkToro as well, and they do have a version that lets you use it for free. So you can like try it out and see what it's like and all of that. So
Yeah, it's amazing. And then also just don't discount Reddit. There's literally, I don't care if your software is for like underwater basket weavers, there's going to be a subreddit for that. And that's just a really good basic place to start to understand how people are thinking about this.
yeah, that's always a good tip too. I said in the chat earlier, I was like, oh my gosh, the amount of subreddits that I'm part of. Like that's a thing. It's like you can really get to know someone based on the subreddits that they've joined over time.
That and also what their FYP page is on TikTok.
Oh yeah. Yes, yeah, you're right. Like if you really want to know somebody. Okay, so how do you define superconductors?
I was hoping they were probably saying superconnectors.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Superconnectors. I love that. These are the people who just seem to know every single person within your niche. So they're kind of what I thought another way to think about it is like 10x connectors. Who are the people that just seem to be like everywhere? Like everyone in that industry knows these folks. Chances are, if you can make friends with those people, that's how you can kind of start to get a lot more influence for whatever your product or service is, and or just get a lot more of that influence and sway.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. And do you kind of separate the ideas of like working and connecting with influencers versus like the super connectors? Are they like overlapping sometimes? Are they one and the same?
There usually have some overlap. I usually like to kind of focus a little bit more on who are the connectors and the super connectors as opposed to pure influencers. Just because influencers can start to get into a gray area, particularly when it comes to like B2C. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of overlap there.
Cool. Okay, next question. Why do you think search results for content on forums like Reddit are higher than website content these days?
Interesting. I've definitely noticed this too. My assumption, and I think it's actually from what I can see just in the last month, I'm definitely seeing a few less Reddit results than I used to see like 3 months ago. So I'm guessing Google is probably making some changes. My very educated guess is I think it's because they want to prioritize more of the unique experiences and the unique expertise as opposed to all of the AI content that sounds the exact same. So that maybe they're over indexing on firsthand perspectives. As someone who's been tagging in Reddit into a lot of search results for probably about 5 years now, I tend to like it. But I also know it can be frustrating when I'm trying to rank some of my clients' content.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. And we actually, and I'll drop this into like the roundup email for the group as well. But we have a session that Tori Gray of the Gray Dot Co did on UGC. She kind of talks about this a little bit more, but what you're saying is like, which is a lot of what pros across the industry are seeing, that Reddit is being prioritized, or like sites like Quora, because it does give unique perspective and information gain. It's not just like consensus content, which we're all tired of, you know?
Yeah. I like to call it 10x copycat content.
Yeah. Yep, that's a good way to put it. Okay, so can you talk a bit about your content hubs? Kim is asking this question.
Yeah, great question, Kim. So my approach to content hubs is pretty much the exact same thing. I feel like a lot of us have all learned, which is building out basically from the hub and spoke model. So having kind of, and I utilized that at the very beginning of that, which is those kind of key themes I went back to. Okay, I kind of go back through and figure out each of those key themes should at least have one hub tied to them, probably more than that. And then building out what is that pillar page? Maybe there might be two of them in some areas as well. And then what are all of the spoke articles that we can kind of angle off of it? That in some cases there might be five. In some cases I've literally had hundreds. And then you just kind of go off of that hub and spoke model.
Yeah, yeah. And do you find that even with the changes in the last 24 months with Google Google algorithms, you all know what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say. You know where I'm going with this. Have you noticed that that model still is working for your clients?
Yes. And the reason why is I do think it's just a good way to make sure that across the board, your content strategy has a structure and a narrative. So
Yeah,
if you're just fight, even if the results of a hub and spoke model become less over time if diminishing returns, and I don't think that actually will happen. I could be wrong, but I just don't see that happening because it hasn't yet. Um, However, it's still just giving you kind of production from what I'd like to call spray and pray. Here's, 500 different ideas.
yeah,
And then suddenly you have a whole bunch of this digital content that's collecting a whole bunch of dust that you've completely forgotten about that becomes super outdated the next time you do a rebrand.
yeah, yeah. I think that's wise. Um, I often like to think about it, and I'm curious if you think about it this way too. Like we talk about the hub and spoke model, and then some people are like skyscraper, pillow articles, it's all dead. And then some people like Bernard's like, no, that could still work, but you need to have perspectives and like range style SEO and blah blah blah. I often think about like in my content strategy work over the years, the next right click. Like, and that's what that model still promotes, that like is a really healthy user experience. And so I'm wondering, like, are
Absolutely.
you still seeing like the same thing where like you got your pillar pages, you've got your like supportive, like shorter cluster articles, but like you're creating like a path basically for users to explore.
Yeah, you said it way better than I just did, Amanda. But I just say I like to say this makes you more thoughtful about how you're going about creating content and the user experience that you want to deliver. So
Yeah.
even if the results go down in time, you're still presenting a much more thoughtful, coherent messaging, coherent user experience so that it's very, very clear what your brand is about and what kind of types of content they can see there.
Yeah, I almost wonder sometimes if like content first professionals like who didn't like start off in SEO and then move into building content for SEO purposes, like people who started off in like copying content first can kind of like see that as less of a tactic and more like a story. You know what I mean? Like building like an entire like a book, like and you can skip around chapters or whatever, you know?
Yeah, that would definitely track from my own experience as someone who kind of started, who fell into marketing by accident. Originally, I went to school for journalism. Very, very, very quickly realized I didn't want to be a journalist full time. And then happened to accidentally get into marketing. So, and from the social and content side.
Yes. Also an accidental marketer here.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of us.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think that's what drives us to it. Okay, last question that I've got submitted here, and then we'll kind of do like a rapid fire at the end because we're on, I think we have like 6 minutes left. So, if ever facing various opinions about how content performs through search, How do you win the debate? Ooh, this is an interesting question. How do you win the debate on prioritizing humans versus the engine when it comes to your content approach? Very interesting question.
I love this question. I wish I knew who was the person who was who submitted it.
Yeah.
This is a great question. I'm going to say just in general, it's going to be, well, who's going to be the person? Well, are you doing content marketing for a product or service? And in that case, humans make those decisions, not bots. So creating content for humans first and foremost is probably going to work out better for you than trying to write for a algorithm or a bot.
Yeah. So I promise you this is not like a clear scope plug, but it's gonna be one. And I'm sorry, everyone. I'm not sorry. You're on a clear scope webinar. Okay. So like before I worked for ClearScope, I used it for a long time. And one of my favorite parts of the tool is that like this focus on storytelling and subject matter expertise and resonating with like customer needs, and then being able to use the tool to speak to the bots. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Like, so like speak to the humans, like write content for the humans, and then like do what you need to for the bots so that you're seen. But like at the end of the day, the bots aren't reading your content. They're just scanning it, you know? Um, but yeah, that was my random clear
I
scope.
love it. I share the same view.
Yes. I love that. I have loved hearing from you today. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. Let's do a couple like rapid fire questions and then like a few of your like takeaways that you want the audience to get from this session today. So, two questions for you. What metrics or KPIs do you focus on to measure the success of like sustainable content strategy over time? Because this stuff can take a while. Like it can be a really slow build, especially for companies just starting with this approach.
Yeah. I would say in general, my North Star metric, and it should be for anyone who's doing content marketing for a business, is leads. And leads is going to be different depending on whether it's like, free trials, demos, straight up going to customers. But like we are writing for businesses and or producing videos or podcasts for businesses. So leads should be a North Star. Does that mean that every single piece of content is going to directly lead to leads? No. But that's where what I consider my sub metrics to go into, which is, are we increasing the amount of brand mentions? Are we increasing, is traffic, this can be a little bit of a slippery slope, but traffic and keyword rankings do still matter. And they're very good sub metrics if those are trending in the right direction, along with brand mentions and also non-branded traffic, as well as branded traffic. Those are kind of what I'm really looking for as those sub metrics. And then increasingly so for social media shares, if social media is a key distribution channel for you, followers, comments, especially comments, reactions, all
Yeah.
of that are great sub metrics and can be very good leading indicators for your lagging indicator, which is leads.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't necessarily know if that was rapid fire enough, but I feel like that's
No, that
what I would
was
have.
that was really helpful. That was a great answer to that question. Okay. So, if you could offer like your top 3 takeaways, like if you could say anything to the content world, what would it be, Jessica? Like what would you want people to take away from your expertise today?
Yeah, great question. Ooh, that's a hard one to answer just in 3, but I would say in general, you can't go wrong if you deeply, deeply, deeply understand who your customers are, and write in the way that they talk, and also write, and also that is key one. You cannot go wrong if you do that. 2, figure out what your brand and also potentially your personal tone, voice, and style is, and figure out a way to make it so deeply you or so deeply your brand that even if your content or your copy were to show up somewhere else, people would still know that it's tied to your brand. And 3, you do not need to stay on the content hamster wheel forever. You do not need to be producing, especially if you're like a lot of my clients who are smaller marketing teams. Do not try to compete with HubSpot. HubSpot's amazing. However, you do not have hundreds of millions of dollars and or hundreds of people who can produce this content for you. Trying to play their game is just not going to work out well for you. So it's much better to focus in on having, these evergreen assets that are going to compound and build your own marketing moat, as opposed to trying to use a playbook that is for much larger companies.
That is good advice. Thank you so much. Jessica, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. I really enjoyed the conversation. I know we've been emailing back the last couple months to get this scheduled, and it's been really nice to meet you in person. Well, in person. But yeah, in person. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I have dropped Jessica's socials where you can find her. And then also in the next 24 hours or so, you'll get the materials from this call, some roundups, like some additional supportive resources. And stay tuned for our next few webinars. And Jessica, how can if anyone wants to, connect with you on the call, like learn more about your services, how can they do that? Where should they go?
Great question. So I'm pretty easy to find online. You can just go to jessicamalnik.com, which is my website. You can also go to my podcast and newsletter, which is theremoteworktribe.com. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn, Threads, and I'm still going to call it Twitter, even though it's technically X.
Yeah, yeah.
I just under my name, Jessica Malnik, and all of those.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to everyone for the great questions. And we hope to see you all again on a future ClearScope webinar. Thanks, Jessica, for coming and sharing your time with us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.